The federal government's employment white paper is expected to spark a stoush over housing and migration. Victoria is slugging short-term rentals like Airbnb with a 7.5% levy, and there's been a sharp rise in homes bought and sold within 24 months, selling at a loss. Welcome to Fear and Greed Business News, Australia's best business podcast. It is Thursday, the 21st of September, 2023. I'm Michael Thompson, and Sean Aylmer is still on holiday, so I'm joined by Jennifer Duke. Jen, good morning.
Good morning, Michael.
Now, Jen, you've got a fantastic interview coming up after the show. You're speaking with Dr. Jackie Fairley, who is the CEO of Star Pharma, a company that we actually talked about last week.
Yes, we did. They had this giant spike in the share price after some groundbreaking advances in a cancer treatment that they've been working on. And it was really interesting talking to Jackie about the real kind of human improvements that their business has on the world and her insights into impact investing for investors. It was really good.
Yeah, it is a great conversation. It's coming up later on, so please stick around for that. It is well worth your time. The main story this morning, though, Jen, the federal government's employment white paper is going to be handed down within days, and it's going to tell businesses exactly how the government intends to bridge the skills gap that's holding back the nation. But it's also going to spark a fight about migration and housing supply, and that threatens to be a powder keg for the government.
So there's several policy areas that are going to be the focus of this white paper, and we'll finally get to see it on Monday. This report is a huge piece of work across government portfolios. It's expected to be the map that the government uses for the National Skills Agreement and the Universities Accord, and those are big pieces of work with the states. But there's also going to be a major focus on reforming the migration system and plugging our skills gap. Treasurer Jim Chalmers is describing it as an outline of the government's vision for the labour market and bringing opportunities to Australians.
Okay, let's focus on the migration part for now. How will the migration debate play out?
So right now there's about 430,000 job vacancies advertised in Australia. And firstly, it's worth mentioning that the Institute of Public Affairs is warning that if the white paper fails to remove red tape and tax barriers, particularly stopping pensioners, veterans and students from working extra hours, then it'll be a missed opportunity. So there are about 550,000 people on their count who fall into these categories and could potentially work if they didn't face these barriers. So as part of this, the IPA is warning against, and here's a good quote from them, the same old lazy approach of unplanned mass migration to fix worker shortages, and that's particularly at a time when we have a shortage of housing. And AMP Chief Economist Jane Oliver is saying that the impact of high immigration levels on housing affordability cannot be ignored. So he says it's good the government is aiming to boost housing supply, but with 500,000 extra people per year via migration is going to exacerbate the problems. He says this needs to be slashed to 200,000 people a year to match the building industry's capacity and reduce housing demand.
Now, Jen, this debate is going to get even more heated after some new data showing home building is slumping badly at the moment. Of course, your day job, Jen, is as economics correspondent for Capital Brief. So I'm assuming that you'd be thinking about the implications of this.
That is a very fair assumption. So the Housing Industry Association has put out latest figures, and it shows that housing starts for the nation's top 100 builders fell to 57,830 in the year to June. Now, that's the lowest that we've seen it in a decade, and it's a 23% fall over the year. We know there's been pain in the construction industry. Insolvencies have also jumped 73%. But at a time when housing affordability is so bad, seeing the worst numbers for home building since 2013 is startling. And the concern is that immigration, if it's not managed well, will become a lightning rod for public anger over housing.
All right, that is a big, big story. And obviously we're going to see all of this play out, particularly next week once the employment white paper is handed down, not just because of the contents of that, but because it starts a lot of these conversations. So this is something that we'll all be talking about for quite some time to come. Jen, how did local markets perform yesterday?
So the S&P ASX 200 closed down 0.5% to 7163 points. Consumer discretionary and industrials performed best over the day, but the deepest falls were for energy and resources. In terms of companies, the best performer was Sayona Mining, up 5%, and the worst was Star Entertainment, down 6.6%. And Kathmandu and Rip Curl store owner KMD Brands reported a 6.4% drop in sales over August. That's because there was unusually warm weather and it cut demand for puffer jackets and other winter wear, and its shares actually fell 4.6%.
Isn't it interesting when you see things as basic as the weather having such a direct flow-on effect to a company's bottom line?
Definitely. It's interesting to see what this summer's going to produce as well for companies.
Yeah, indeed. Now, what's happening in international markets?
So, Japanese officials are on the edge of intervening and buying up yen in the foreign exchange market if movements in the currency are too intense, and officials are staying in close contact with their US counterparts about this. So, US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen says that any intervention is understandable, but only if it's to smooth out this volatility and not to affect the exchange rate. Over in China, domestic bond issuance by local government financing vehicles have jumped 50% in August compared to the month before. Now, this is the third highest month on record, that's on Bloomberg figures, and it suggests that investors are much more comfortable with putting their money into provincial government projects, at least in the short term. And this aligns with a program from Beijing to help them repay local debts. And over in the US, 5 and 10-year Treasury yields are at the highest level since 2007.
All right, we'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Jen, it seems fire season is already in full swing. Hundreds of firefighters have been battling about 80 fires across New South Wales, including at Araring near Newcastle. This is the second day of serious fires in the latest heat wave, and it's on the back of the announcement that we are officially in an El Nino year.
So Sydney's hitting record temperatures for September, and both Greater Sydney and the Greater Hunter were put on an extreme fire danger alert yesterday morning with a total fire ban over the day. Now, the Bureau of Meteorology was advising anyone in fire districts to carry out their bushfire survival plans and be monitoring the situation, and it's clearly a sign of what's to come for the rest of spring and summer.
Yeah, it is clearly very worrying. Now, Jen, we talked earlier about migration, and there is currently a skilled migration overhaul underway. Businesses are potentially going to be able to bring in skilled workers paid $120,000 or more, and the visa application process will only take weeks.
So a migration review will soon be released by the federal government, and early details have been floated with industry. And there's media reports now suggesting we might see a tiered migration system, and that means few restrictions for high-wage workers, but more regulation for low-paid workers, such as in the care sector. That's for those under, say, $70,000. And the financial review notes that stakeholders have been told the highest skill salary level is likely to be $120,000. But it could also be closer to $150,000. Now, this salary figure is the source of huge debate between the unions, who want it nearer to $200,000, and business groups who want it to be closer to $98,000. And there's going to be this streamlined application process also put in place following the review earlier this year.
Now, one I mentioned at the top of the show, Jen, Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews is slugging short-term holiday rentals with a 7.5% levy on earnings. This will actually make Victoria the first state to do something like this, to put a levy like this in place.
Yeah, so it's a new Airbnb tax, is what everyone's sort of branding it as, and it's going to hit more than 36,000 short stay accommodation properties in the state. About half of these are actually in the regions. Andrew said that the tax is modest, and while he acknowledged that it wouldn't be universally popular, he thinks it strikes that right balance between those who, say, want short stay accommodation banned completely and those who think that any charge is too extreme. Now, the revenue raised from this levy is intended to be given to Homes Victoria, and that's to help fund the building and maintenance of social and affordable housing. Andrew said that the people who rent the short stay properties would be those ultimately paying the charge.
Jen, Sydney Airport is accusing United Arab Emirates-based airlines of failing to use 50% of the capacity that they've been given. Now, this amounts to more than 80 flights a week and, of course, follows the government's decision to refuse more for Qatar Airways, which uses all of its 28 flights.
So the airport's CEO, Jeff Colbert, has told a Senate inquiry that more than 14,000 landing slots aren't being used annually, as airlines are in general not using their full capacity. So he said that flights have returned to 90% of pre-pandemic levels, but airlines have been requesting 100% of slots or even more. And this means that about 40 slots aren't being used every single day from global airlines. This affects the ability of other airlines to get access. And there was another announcement about Sydney Airport as well. There's going to be a new CEO incoming. That's outgoing Transurban boss Scott Charlton is going to be taking up the role in December.
How about this one, Jen? Tesla Australia and the Commonwealth Bank have teamed up. The new partnership is for financing of the electric vehicles, and it is really part of a big push to increase EV uptake.
So Combank's announced it is now the preferred finance provider for Tesla and is offering discounted interest rates for buyers of the specific brand. So according to their statement, the bank has backed more than $50 million worth of eligible sustainable product purchases for retail customers since October last year. And they've researched their customers and they found some really interesting statistics. So 64% were eager to buy an electric or a hybrid car if they get a financial incentive to do so. And for business customers, 40% are intending to use EVs or hybrids in the next 6 to 12 months. That's compared to less than 15% right now. It's a huge growth market.
That is very, very quick, that growth rate. It'll be interesting to see if those figures do actually play out that way, because that is a tremendous growth rate.
Yeah, there's a lot of hype around EVs right now, and they are still quite expensive compared to other cars. So I'm curious to see whether or not cost of living pressures will have any effect on those projections.
Yeah, I'm going to make a note in the diary and I'm going to come back and check those figures in 12 months from now and see just how accurate they are. Now, Jen, banks could be forced to maintain rural branches as part of their banking license operations. That's one idea that's being discussed by senators, which was raised during a public hearing for an inquiry into regional bank closures.
So CBA Chief Executive Matt Comyn actually pushed back on this suggestion, saying the bank is in consultations already with mayors and local communities in the country, and they have agreements to maintain a rural network until 2026. He thinks there's a potential commercial return as well to stay in those rural areas as other banks are closing. But he did say that banking preferences have changed and Australia Post is now supplying banking services to country residents. Westpac boss Peter King was also up in the inquiry, and he says that digital banking is taking over from networks and banking behaviours have changed over time for them too. 96% of Westpac customer transactions are now actually digital.
Australia Post, have you ever used Bank at Post, Jen?
No, I haven't, and I am a country resident.
No, it's the funny thing is it's actually really easy to use, and this sounds like an ad for Bank at Post and Australia Post. I assure you, it's not. It's just actually my experience using it. It is a very handy alternative to having a bank. If you need to cash a check, for instance, which is
who's cashing a check, Michael?
But that's the thing that you don't really need to go into a bank very often unless you have one of those really kind of face-to-face things, which is like cashing a check. And on those rare instances, say you sell a car or you have an elderly relative send you a check for a new child, a new baby, for instance. Now, clearly, I'm giving personal examples here, and you need to deposit that check. Bank at Post is actually a really easy way to do it. And you take your check in, you take your card in, and they just swipe it all through, and it's done in about 30 seconds.
You need to let grandma know that checks are being phased out by the government.
You can't do that. You'll give them a shock. No, I think that it's safest that we'll phase it out over a long period of time and everyone will be happy. But just keep that time frame nice and long. Now, Jen, we mentioned this one at the top of the show as well. 1 in 10 homes bought and sold within a 2-year time frame is selling for a loss. These short-term resale losses are actually up from just 2.7% last year on CoreLogic figures.
So first of all, I want to point out that still means the vast majority of homes sell for more than they were bought for, even in the short term. But when you're factoring in selling costs, stamp duty and potential investment taxes, which this didn't, it's a pretty interesting finding to think about. And you've got to bear in mind that there has been a lift in home values over the more recent period. So CoreLogic actually notes that the portion of homes that's being sold in this quick turnaround period is also up, though just slightly, by about 1 percentage point over the past year, which suggests that there are more sellers willing to take a bit of a hit. That could be due to high interest rates.
So just quickly digging into those figures a little bit more, how much are sellers actually losing?
So the median hit for someone who takes a loss was $30,000 for these short-term flips, but the median profit was $75,000, and the majority of the losses were owner-occupiers selling houses in capital cities. But there was also an unusually high portion of regional properties that were selling after these short holding periods over the past year. So in fact, they actually make up 11% or so of these resales, and that's up from a decade average of about 7%.
Should the government, Jen, include a gender balance in its procurement practices? That is the proposal of Entrepreneurial and Small Business Women Australia, which wants more inclusiveness in Commonwealth procurement rules.
So this advocacy group made a submission to the Small Business Ombudsman where they suggested better procurement processes to support female-led small and medium businesses. And the group says there's a serious lack of female participation in Commonwealth tenders and they want to fix it. Some of the issues here include a lack of awareness and resources among female-led businesses about these procurement processes and a low proportion of small businesses being tapped for them more generally. But they also note that there isn't a gender equality criteria, and they've now suggested specific thresholds be put in place for minority and women-owned businesses to help close the gap.
Qantas CEO Vanessa Hudson has been asked to head to mediation in person with the head of the Transport Workers Union alongside a small contingent of lawyers to decide on compensation for the airline's 1,700 unlawfully sacked employees.
So this case was back in front of a judge yesterday, and this time in the federal court following the High Court's decision last week to uphold the case against Qantas. So right now the airline and the workers need to figure out how much compensation is going to be appropriate. The union wanted open court rather than mediation, saying it would improve transparency, but the federal court says that's more expensive and resource intensive, and instead mediation will begin next week. Now, interestingly, the judge specifically requested that the highest levels attend, so no more than one senior and one junior counsel, 2 solicitors, and Hudson and Union Secretary Michael Caine. Qantas wanted their in-house legal counsel to attend instead, but the judge knocked this back to maximise prospects of coming to a settlement.
There were some eye-watering numbers as well out about former CEO Alan Joyce's pay when he left the airline.
So Joyce was paid $21.4 million as he exited, and $14.4 million of that is subject to clawback provisions. The Qantas board is going to withhold bonuses until it receives the outcome of the competition watchdog inquiry into those tickets sold for cancelled flights.
Okay, last one before we get to international news. Former Treasurer and current Nine Entertainment Chair Peter Costello has weighed into the Reserve Bank debate. Costello doesn't want the RBA to be required to equally consider full employment and price stability, which was a key recommendation of the review into the central bank.
So these dual goals of full employment and inflation targets are expected to be part of this new statement on the conduct of monetary policy. And that's a task on Treasurer Jim Chalmers and new Governor Michelle Bullock's to-do list for the few months ahead. But Costello says there is no reason to change the institutional arrangements, and making these two goals have equal weighting could risk watering down the importance of the current 2 to 3% inflation target. Now, Costello actually formalised this target in '96 when he was in government, and he told the AFR that the government's responsible for full employment because it has the tools at its disposal to manage it, and that includes the industrial relations system, tax, immigration, and training.
All right, turning to international news now, and major international banks including Citigroup, BNP, HSBC and Standard Chartered plc are reportedly looking at new ways, Jen, to help protect Indian Ocean habitats. They're exploring financing options for a $15 billion program.
This could actually be one of the biggest environmental initiatives funded by financial institutions, and they're looking at bonds and debt for nature swaps. This initiative is backed by the International Union for Conservation of Nature and the United Nations, and it's part of the Great Blue Wall Initiative. It's already raised $100 million, and Bloomberg's confirmed that another $200 million will soon be announced as part of a project preparation facility. But this new public-private capital financing from the banks would be a major step up. So debt for nature swaps allow sovereign issuers to refinance existing debt in exchange for pledges to conserve the environment. And we've seen similar deals, but at a much smaller scale before, including with the Nature Conservancy in the US. They actually helped refinance $1 billion using debt for nature swaps. And this entire market is estimated by Barclays to potentially be worth $800 billion at peak.
US President Joe Biden is concerned about peace talks that would carve up Ukraine. He's calling on world leaders to stop Russia from winning land off Ukraine.
That's the key message from Biden's annual speech to the UN's General Assembly in New York. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky was in attendance. While Biden said he wanted a diplomatic resolution, he said in exchange for peace, Russia wants Ukraine's territory, children, and capitulation. And he said no nation's independence would be guaranteed if they bowed to this, so they should stand up against the aggression. Now, Biden is currently pushing for new support for Ukraine in Congress, and he also said in the UN speech that he is aiming to manage relations with China responsibly to avoid tipping things there into conflict. He said they're de-risking, not decoupling from China.
Okay, last one. China has appealed the World Trade Organization's rejection of its Trump-era tariffs of $2.4 billion worth of American imports.
So China's Ministry of Commerce says that Beijing believes the expert panel's ruling contains legal errors, and they were arguing it's to safeguard their national rights and interests. The World Trade Organization ruled in mid-August that China violated trade commitments when it put these tariffs on US goods, and this was in response to former President Donald Trump's steel and aluminium duties. Now, those duties were worth 25% and 10% respectively, and they applied to imports globally. Now, that's important because the World Trade Organization members are required to abide by what's known as the most favored nation principle, and this requires them to treat other members indiscriminately. China imposed tariffs just on US goods, specifically including aluminium waste, pork, fruit, and nuts, and that's why they're in trouble.
Okay, up next is the Fear and Greed Daily interview. We mentioned it before. It is a great chat. You're speaking with Dr. Jackie Fairley, CEO of Star Pharma.
That's right. And Jackie's actually retiring from Star Pharma next year. And she sort of talked about what she's most proud of during her 16 years with the business and what they've managed to deliver. It was pretty inspiring, actually.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible to think about the share price bump that they had last week and then the human impact of the products that they are developing. It's a really, really interesting conversation. So it's coming up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. Thank you, Jen.
Thanks, Michael.
It is Thursday, the 21st of September, 2023. Make sure you're following the podcast and join us online on LinkedIn, Instagram, X and Facebook. I'm Michael Thompson, and that was Fear and Greed Business News. Have a great day.